Hello, my name is Tom Repass of Canyon Rim Honeybees in the beautiful Black Hills of western South Dakota. This presentation is a part of a series of Introduction to Beekeeping presentations that I have recorded as a video. This video is things to consider before you get started, before you even get your bees. In some of the other presentations, I'll go into some of the more specifics about what to do once you have bees, hive inspections, hive management, beekeeping equipment, bee diseases, and so on. And before we get started, a little bit about me and my background. I'm a fourth-generation beekeeper, winemaker, and mead maker. I got my first hives exactly 40 years ago at age 13 in 1981. I'm a certified master beekeeper through the University of Montana, and I breed queen bees in the Black Hills of South Dakota, focusing on mite-tolerant, winter-hardy, gentle, and productive bees. I've done a lot of education all over the United States to groups large and small, and I decided to put some of these presentations into narrated video presentations for folks thinking about beekeeping or who have just started beekeeping so that they can learn from some of these presentations. Things to consider before you begin. You know, over the years I've met a lot of folks who get bees and then they realize they really don't know very much about them, and definitely that's not what we recommend. It's important to think about the reasons why you might want to become a beekeeper. Consider how much time, effort, and money. I mean, let's be honest, beekeeping can be expensive. Where can you learn about bees and beekeeping, ideally before you get the bees? Finding a mentor, if you can find an experienced beekeeper to help you out, to bounce questions off of, or to help you if you have any issues or questions. Beekeeping clubs and associations, local rules and regulations, and consider what your bees will need in order to succeed, and also where will you keep them. So why become a beekeeper in the first place? You know, folks who are not beekeepers think those of us that keep bees are just a little bit nuts. I mean, why would a person want to have these stinging insects, any one of them, you know, that could sting you if it has the desire to do so? Well, obviously, you know, I've been a beekeeper for most of my life, and I don't even really think about it. I've been doing it for so long. But for someone first starting out who maybe didn't fall into it because, you know, they're from a beekeeping family, first you need to ask yourself, you know, why do you want to keep bees at all? What do you want to get out of beekeeping? How much time do you want to spend? Effort and money. So there's a lot of reasons to keep bees, and a lot of times new or non-beekeepers say, oh, you must make your own honey. And of course I do, but that's for myself. That's actually maybe the third or fourth reason I have bees. You know, I love them. I enjoy being with them. I enjoy learning about them. My main focus as a beekeeper is breeding queens, and to be sure, I like the honey, but in a year when I don't get any honey, because it's a drought, it's still a fine year to have bees. Obviously, I prefer the years where the flowers are blooming and there's plenty of honey coming in. Bees produce many other products also. Beeswax, propolis. Bees are important for pollination. There was a time when I moved to where I live now where I didn't have any beehives at the place, and there really weren't any bees on any of the flowers, and even some of our vegetables just, you know, that needed to be pollinated really didn't produce very much. And then until finally I brought some hives home, and then we see bees everywhere on all of our vegetables and berry bushes and fruit trees. Some folks have heard that bees have been struggling, and so they want to get involved that way. And then bees are just awesome. They're amazing little creatures. You know, I've been doing this for 40 years, and I still see things that are new or different, and I'm still learning. You know, beekeeping is something that you'll never tire of or become bored. They're just amazing creatures. So, you know, what do you want to get out of beekeeping? A hobby for your own personal enjoyment? I mean, that's how I started, you know, when I was a kid. A part-time sideline business. You know, as I said, I'm a queen bee breeder. Obviously, I make most of my income from other pursuits, but it is nice. Beekeeping can be expensive, and it is nice you can get a little bit of income, whether it's from selling honey or bees. Or do you want to do it as a full-time occupation and become a commercial beekeeper? So how much time, effort, and money do you want to spend on this? There are upfront costs in equipment. Of course, once you've invested in the equipment, it will last for a number of years, so you're not going to need to buy more equipment unless you're expecting to increase the number of hives you have, which I find that often happens. People have a couple of hives in the backyard, and before you know it, they have 5 or 10 hives, and before you know it, they start finding other places to put their hives. There will be ongoing costs. You will need to feed the bees at certain times, especially if there's not enough honey has come in. There are treatments for mites. You will need to buy new bees, at least until you learn how to raise your own replacements. The other thing is beekeeping is not quite as intuitive as keeping other animals. Folks move to the country and, maybe they've had a dog or cat and they want to get chickens. It's not that hard to understand that, they need housing, food, water, shelter. Obviously, keeping chickens is different than a dog, but it kind of, it's kind of intuitive. With bees, however, they're insects, and we don't, as humans, we don't intuitively know what they need or recognize what they need quite as easily, and it just comes from experience, spending time with the bees, reading, learning, taking classes. There definitely is a learning curve. When you first open a hive and you're a brand new beekeeper and seeing all of those insects that potentially could sting you, it can be intimidating, even when you're wearing your gloves and your suit and your veil, and then just wondering what's going on. You see queen cells in the hive, and why? Are they replacing the queen? Are they going to swarm? Did I accidentally kill the queen last week when I was checking the hive? And a lot of these you just won't know, even though you can read all you want in a book or watch YouTube videos. A lot of this, comes from hands-on learning, so it's not always as intuitive or as simple as you might think. And I think the worst part is some of your bees will die. You will lose hives occasionally. I don't lose very many. My average annual losses are now around, about 10 or 15%. If anything is less than 20%, I'm happy about that. But there's a lot of beekeepers are losing 50% or more of their hives. And when you start out, there's going to be things that you don't know about, like mite control, for example, that you'll end up losing hives over it. Now, when I first started out in the 80s, if you lost more than 15 or 20% of your hives per year, you were thought of as being a bad beekeeper. And yet now, colony losses on average are as high as 40 or 50% per year, and sometimes some years beekeepers even lose more than that, even as many as 80% or more of their colonies. And it's devastating. It's not just even the loss of money from having to bought those bees and then having them die, but it really it's very saddening to see so many colonies being lost. There has been a decrease in the total number of colonies in the U.S. compared to the 1940s. And, the causes are complex, but, back in the 40s, World War II and afterwards, honey was thought of as a valuable source of sugar. Over time, we've started using other forms of sugar, such as, cane sugar or beet sugar or even high fructose corn syrup. So the demand for honey is still high, but not as much as it was. And then even farming and agriculture has changed. Back in the 1940s and 50s, there were a lot of small farms that had many different types of livestock and poultry, which has changed to where there's more monoculture and more farms focusing on raising one type of livestock or one type of crop. And so the mixed farming that we used to see has also changed. So it used to be there was, the farmer might have a few beehives out back, the same as they might have chickens and pigs and cattle, and that's kind of changed. But the good news is that over the last few years anyway, the colony count seems to be stable. So we've certainly had problems as beekeepers because of these losses where we have to raise more replacements, but the total colony count within the U.S. has been relatively stable, so that's good news. An important question to ask yourself is how much will it cost? A lot of folks say, oh yeah, I'd like to get into beekeeping, but when they find out the cost of the equipment and the bees, they're like, wow, that's expensive. That's maybe something I'm not really interested in, which is fine, but you just need to ask yourself, are you willing to commit the time and the money to invest in becoming a beekeeper. And to start out with one hive, it's going to be $400 to $500, including the bees and everything else. A second hive will not necessarily be that much because some of the equipment you can share among the hives. And then there's other equipment you might not need the first year, such as honey extractors, honey supers, bottles to put your honey in. When you first start out as a new beekeeper, you may want to see if you could borrow or use someone else's equipment, at least until, or you even use equipment. Sometimes beekeeping clubs will actually have a honey extractor for their members to use. And most of us, experienced beekeepers, when we're asked, how many hives should you start out with, we recommend at least 2, if not 3 colonies. And I know that's more expensive, but the reason is if you only have one colony, basically all your eggs are in one basket. And if that colony succeeds or fails, there's not a lot you can do about it. But if you have 2 or 3 colonies, if one colony isn't doing very well, you can trade brood from the stronger colony to the weaker colony. Or let's say your colony loses its queen. You can put in a frame of eggs from another colony, and that queenless colony can raise a new queen from that. But if you only have one single colony, whether it does well or it does not do well, you don't have a lot of options to help it out as you might if you have more than one colony. And the other thing is you'll have a better idea of what is a successful hive versus not successful. I find if there's 3 colonies, one might be doing okay, one might be struggling, and another one might be doing amazingly well. And if you only had one, you wouldn't know if it was doing amazingly well or doing poorly because you don't have that side-by-side comparison. Well, what if you're not quite ready to have bees, but you still want to help them? There's a lot of things you can do. You can plant a pollinator-friendly garden, and of course this is more than just helping bees, but other pollinators as well, including butterflies and hummingbirds and some of the wild bees like bumblebees, for example. A wonderful resource is the Xerces Society, and they have lists of native pollinators that you might plant. I'm up here in the Great Plains, so I would use this resource, but you can find resources at this website that are specific to your part wherever you happen to be. Bees need water. Sometimes they'll go to your dog dish or maybe to a bird bath, but you can set it out in your garden, and the bees can drown, so you don't want that to happen. So putting a little bit of water with gravel or some wet sand is an excellent place for bees and also other pollinators such as butterflies to go and get water safely. You can put up homes for native or solitary bees, like this bee house for mason bees. And a helpful book, again, by the Xerces Society is How to Attract Native Pollinators. Or if you want to have honeybees but you're not quite ready to have them yourself, you can allow a beekeeper to keep hives on your property. Beekeepers are often looking for places to put their hives, and sometimes they'll pay their rent as a little bit of honey. It varies depending where you are. Up here it's about 1 or 2 pounds per hive per year typically. But obviously talk to the beekeeper first to know what they're willing to do, and if you're interested, they might even have you tag along and help them out or observe while you're opening up a beehive, and you can kind of learn just by watching the beekeeper work and asking questions. And then you can help out local beekeepers by buying honey directly from them, or a source that you trust, so you know that it's real honey that you're getting and it's not something that was brought in from who knows where and contaminated with who knows what. So where can you learn about bees and beekeeping? Sources, a lot of resources available, books, online forums and videos, beekeeping classes, magazines, journals, experienced beekeepers, beekeeping clubs. You have to be careful on social media. On social media, everybody's a, quote, expert, unquote, but not really, and sometimes the most strongly opinionated people actually are the ones that know the least. So you have to be careful about that. There are plenty of YouTube videos out there, but not all of them are as high quality in regards to knowledge and expertise. If someone's trying to portray something as being simple, I would always be questioning that, because beekeeping is not always quite as simple as it seems, or if there's they try to have a one solution for everything. So some of the books that I recommend, this one's a little bit out of date for some of the treatments, regarding like mite management and all of that. But other than that, it can be a very helpful book, just keeping in mind that there are newer books available and newer resources. Another book by Kim Flodham is The Backyard Beekeeper, and this is for someone who's an absolute beginner and interested in having a few hives in their backyard. And then Dr. Larry Connor has a series of books, and this one is Bee Essentials. It's a guide for new beekeepers. Some bee clubs use this book as their textbook for their students. The Beekeeper's Bible, this is more of a reference text. So it goes all the way through from the history of beekeeping, through bee biology, some of the how-to aspects of beekeeping, and then some of the products of the hive, how to use honey and wax and so forth. Honeybee biology and beekeeping. This is used at some of the college-level beekeeping courses, and it's a comprehensive text which has information for everyone, both brand new starting out beekeepers to more experienced beekeepers. The ABCs and XYZs of bee culture. This is an encyclopedia, and I have actually several editions of this. It's been published since the late 1800s. It's not so much a how-to book, but just a reference text that you can look up pretty much anything related to bees. The Hive and the Honeybee, the newest edition particularly, the 2015 edition, has been expanded. And honestly, if I could have only one book about beekeeping, the 2015 edition of The Hive and the Honeybee would be it. There are plenty of other editions available, and obviously if you get an older edition, you have to keep in mind that some of the information may be out of date. They're still interesting. I mean, I have some editions from I think the 70s or 80s that I look at, and it reminds me of my time as a new beekeeper when I was first starting out. But the 2015 edition has pretty much anything you'd want to know or learn or about beekeeping. There are some online websites and YouTube videos and whatnot. There's some resources that I recommend. The University of Guelph up in Canada has a great series of videos. The UK National Honey Show has some presentations online. Randy Oliver's website, Scientific Beekeeping, has some excellent resources where you can really learn basically the science of beekeeping and hive management. Some other folks, Mike Palmer, Dave Cushman, and Jason Chrisman, have some videos online. And so you can find some of these online, and they can be a very helpful resource for further learning. There are two journals available to subscribe to, Bee Culture and then the American Bee Journal. They're very useful. You can find out about the honey market. There's often educational information within some of these journals. And I strongly recommend that you take a beekeeping course or class. I presented at the Wyoming Bee College in March, and with the pandemic, there hasn't been any in-person courses or classes the way that we used to do them. University of Minnesota offers some classes on beekeeping in northern climates. I'm sure once the pandemic is over, we're going to start having some in-person classes again. University of Montana, it's a 3-year program, which if you go through that whole program, you will get a Master Beekeeper certificate. But even if you're just a brand new beekeeper just starting out, just taking the first year, the apprentice year, is very valuable. It can really give you some excellent education. And some of these do cost money, and I know folks are like, well, I don't know if I want to spend money on this, but think about how much the bees themselves cost and what it would cost to replace those bees if they die, through lack of knowledge or just, making a mistake. So anytime you can invest in your education so you're a better beekeeper, it can help you save money in the long run by losing less bees. Finding a mentor. If you're fortunate enough to find an experienced beekeeper to mentor you, it can be very helpful to avoid some of the mistakes that many of us had when we started out. A mentor will know the local conditions and beekeeping environment. They can tell you when swarm season is going to arrive or the honey flow. They can help you avoid some of the common beginner's mistakes that we all made when we were first starting out. They can be somebody to bounce questions off of. Maybe you have a question about something you're seeing in the hive, or you're not sure if the hive is queenless, or you're not sure whatever it is. You can bounce questions of, and if they're local, maybe they could even stop by and take a peek at your hives and help you out. And then the best mentors will be a good role model and offer positive encouragement. So what are the characteristics of an ideal mentor? Ideally they've had several years of successful beekeeping. Unless someone's been keeping bees for 10 years or so, they're probably still learning themselves. Of course, we all are. Even if you're keeping bees for 30 or 40 years, we're still learning. Someone who's, maybe their second or third year into beekeeping, maybe that's a little bit better than being brand new, but there may be things that they, that they think they know but they don't know as well as they should. And so it's best to find a mentor that has had some years of experience. They're not trying to actively push one philosophy over another. They're not saying treatment-free is the only way to keep bees, or you have to, do this or do that or use this kind of hive. I mean, they might have preferences, as we all do, but they're open-minded enough to realize that there's many ways to successfully keep bees. And just because someone is keeping bees differently, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. They're willing to share their knowledge and experience. When I first started out, I was lucky. I had, I come from a family of beekeepers, but there were other beekeepers around, and they were pretty close-lipped. They wouldn't really share any of their knowledge or secrets with you. Maybe it was because they were just very introverted, or they weren't interested in teaching. So, obviously you need to find somebody who has a personality type and individual style that fits with yours. Maybe you don't mind, someone who's very quiet and introverted and doesn't really say very much. Or maybe you prefer someone a little bit more outgoing. And the ideal mentor is the first to admit that they don't know everything there is to know about bees and beekeeping. If you ever meet a beekeeper who's experienced and they seem to have all the answers, you probably need to go the other direction from them, because no one has answers. You need to kind of stay away from the folks that think they know everything and have all the answers, because honestly, beekeeping is much more complicated than that. So where can you find a mentor? Local beekeeping clubs are very helpful. It's a great reason to be a member. And again, with the pandemic in 2020, a lot of the clubs were not meeting quite as much, but now with the pandemic slowly coming to an end and people getting vaccinated, some of the clubs are beginning to meet again in person. If you have family or friends who are experienced beekeepers, obviously those are a great resource. Or you might be going to a farmer's market and somebody might be selling honey there. You might start talking to them and asking them about their experience beekeeping, or maybe whether or not they'd want to help you learn, or have any answer any questions you might have. And honestly, if you happen to be driving by and you see beehives in a field or a backyard and there's somebody out there working them, you might just stop by and introduce yourself. I've done that many times, just to introduce myself. I just saw somebody with beehives just to see who they are. Most beekeepers are very happy to talk to someone about their bees, even if you're not yet a beekeeper. Joining a beekeeping club, you can meet other local beekeepers and learn about some of the local issues, perhaps local regulations. You can find a mentor. The best clubs will offer beekeeping education and classes. Maybe they even have live hive demonstrations out in the apiary. You can get on the swarm call list that way, and then some of them may be producing nukes or even queens that you can purchase your bees from. And so in the ideal club, you want a diversity of experiences and interests where different points of view are encouraged. I've been very fortunate. The bee clubs that I've been involved in have had wonderful members and wonderful education. But I've heard stories about some clubs that were maybe controlled by a strong personality or group of people. Maybe they were very close-minded. This is the only way you can keep bees, or whatnot. And if you go to a club like that and it just doesn't seem right for you, you can always find other clubs. And they should be very welcoming to new members and hopefully hold regular meetings. So where can you find out about local clubs? Well, obviously from other beekeepers, maybe your county extension office. Most states have a state beekeeper, and the State Department of Ag also often will have resources for beekeepers that they can steer you in the direction of local or regional beekeeping clubs. Local rules and regulations. So every state will have different rules and regulations regarding beekeeping, regarding registering hives, the inspection of the hives of disease, health certificates, location of the bee yards. Some states have a rule that the bee yards can't be, for example, any closer than 3 miles apart or some other distance. And then some local communities themselves, some of the towns and cities may have regulations whether you can have hives, how many, where you can put them. You know, I'm in South Dakota and Wyoming, and just this is a contrast showing how even though these are states that are, you know, side by side right next door, they do have slightly different rules and regulations. And so if I wanted to have any hives in Wyoming, I'd have to consider that, you know, the process there is slightly different than on the South Dakota side of the state line where I have my hives. Every state is slightly different, and you can usually find this online through the State Department of Agriculture. And it's always better to know what the regulations are before you get your bees instead of finding out later that you broke the law. If it was minor, usually you'll just get off with a warning, but you know, you don't want any fines or to be in trouble with anybody. So it's always better to know what the regulations are before you get your bees and turn out, you know, inadvertently breaking a rule somewhere. Okay, so what do bees need to succeed and flourish? Well, just like any other animal, you know, they have certain basic needs. They need food, so they need nectar and pollen, which they will gather naturally. Nectar is basically sugar, and it provides the carbohydrate and the energy, whereas the pollen is protein, and it also has other nutrients in it that the bees use for themselves and to raise brood or baby bees. There may be times of the year when the flowers are not blooming, however, so you'll need to provide them replacement sources for this. They also need water. They need water not just to drink, but they also use that to help cool their hive through evaporative cooling. And you know, ideally, you want them to go to a source they're not going to be bothering anybody. You know, like the neighbor's pool or hot tub or their dog water dish. And they need to shelter, you know, not just the hive itself, but the hive needs to be put in a nice dry place out of the wind near flowers. And then protection from diseases and parasites. So with food, during the warm months, bees will fly to gather floral resources, flowers in the area. And they can fly, you know, 3 miles away and even more if they need to. Now, to be honest, if there is flowers blooming much closer, you know, they're not going to necessarily fly that far. It's sort of like you going to the grocery store. You might not drive, you know, 5 hours to go to the grocery store if there happens to be one, you know, just down around the corner. So nectar is made into honey. Basically, the nectar is gathered from the flower, and the bees add some enzymes, and then they evaporate it and they store it, and they can use this honey at times of the year when maybe there's no flowers blooming, such as the winter. And then pollen is a protein source fed to the baby bees, or it's stored as bee bread, which has a little bit of honey added to it, and then it does actually undergo a lactic fermentation, you know, the similar as making a sourdough bread or something like that. But if natural sources aren't available, you might need to feed your bees at certain times of the year. And we'll get into that a little bit more in some of the other presentations. So bees require a source of water for diluting honey during the times of the year when there's not fresh nectar coming in, and also for cooling the hive in hot weather. And, you know, interestingly, they prefer less clean sources of water. So you might put out this wonderful clean source of water and the bees will ignore it, and instead they're going to go to the muddy puddle. They sometimes get attracted to chlorine or even salt. If your neighbor or you have a hot tub with chlorine or a saline pool, the bees might prefer that over a source of fresh water. So putting out a source of water will help them encourage them to not use some of the unwanted sources. And then shelter. You know, the ideal hive, it has certain specifications. It has enough space. The bees need a place to store all of that honey for winter, and then also any additional honey that they might make for you, any surplus that you can harvest and use for yourself. They need enough space for the population as it increases in the spring and summer. It needs to be dry and weather tight. Although be aware that the bees do not heat the entire hive, but they only keep the part of the hive where the cluster is warm. So I see some beekeepers doing all kinds of things like, insulating the house, their house. They try to insulate the hive the same way, which it's good to be weather tight so the wind is not blowing through that hive or onto that hive. But they're not really heating the whole hive with central heating the way we humans do with our houses. So the way you might keep that hive weather tight might be different than how you might insulate your house. And then the hives are in a good location. I know some folks are urban beekeepers, and there's plenty of flowers in the city, but if you put them on the top of a tall skyscraper, it might be really hard for those bees to fly all the way down to get to get to the flowers down at street level and then fly all the way up. And there's flowers almost everywhere, whether it's in the mountains or the deserts. But just being aware that certain times of the year there might not be as many flowers. In the south, you might want to keep them out of the direct sun. But up north, we probably want them to be where they're getting some sun exposure, especially in the winter. And then, of course, out of the wind, especially if you're like out here on the prairie. And then they need to be protected from disease and parasites. And the most destructive parasite is the varroa mite. If you learn one thing as a new beekeeper, is you need to know how to manage these and keep them from decimating and killing your hives. We didn't have to deal with this when I first started out in the 80s, and it really changed everything. To be successful as a beekeeper, you need to pay attention to these and treat your hives, whether it's through IPM or more treatments or whatever, or using resistant types of bees. The varroa mite reproduces on the brood, and it weakens the adult bees by, we used to think feeding on the hemolymph, but actually that's not quite true. They actually feed on the fat body, as Dr. Sam Ramsey has shown. And not only do these mites weaken the bee themselves, but they also spread viruses. And just think about it. You have something the size, if it was a life size on a human, this mite would be the size of a dinner plate. Imagine it attached to you and sucking and eating through your skin into, say, your liver. Obviously, that wouldn't be a very good thing, and you wouldn't do very well. There are certainly other diseases that can weaken or kill hives. Eczema, particularly Eczema ceranii, can be deadly to hives. Some of these other things, like chalkbrood, are more of an annoyance. They're not really deadly, but they can weaken the hive. And then you've got the two types of foul brood, with American foul brood being the worst, because you can't really reuse the equipment, and you end up having to often destroy the equipment if you get American foul brood in your colony. I'll talk more about the diseases and parasites in another presentation. But it is essential that you understand how to manage and treat for varroa mites, or you will lose hives. On the forums or even in real life, I've heard new beekeepers saying, "My hive died. I don't know why my hive died." And the first question is, did you treat for mites? Oh no, we didn't see any mites. We didn't treat. Just because you can't see them or see them easily doesn't mean they're not there. I mean, unless you're in a place like Australia where there's not any mites yet, you will have mites in your hives, and you're going to have to do something to manage them to keep them from killing some of your hives. So where will you keep your bees? Well, you can keep them in many places. I mean, if you live in a rural area, you can keep them in an orchard or a pasture. If you're a backyard beekeeper, you can put them, in your garden somewhere, behind the fence. And then there's people keeping bees in the city. So you can pretty much have bees anywhere that flowers are nearby blooming, where, obviously it's allowed by local regulations. An apiary is basically a place where the beehives are kept. So some of us call it a location, some of us call it a bee yard. You want them to have a windbreak away from the prevailing wind. Honey boxes can be heavy, so ideally you should be able to drive up to the beehives, or at least be able to get there with a wagon or a wheelbarrow. There should be running water or fresh water nearby, whether you provide that or it's a stream or a pond. You don't want to put it in a place, down by a floodplain, for example, by a river or stream, because the colonies could be flooded or washed away. Plus, if you're located at the bottom of a hill or down by a stream, there's a lot more cooler air, so that can actually be cooler in the winter. So you'd rather have it, on the side of a hill or a flat place. So it is difficult, not impossible to move hives, but if you decide that you have your hives here and you want to move them, I don't know, say 50 feet away to another part of your backyard, it's going to have to be careful in how you move them, because if you just move them over there, the bees will go to the back, back to the original location. And there are techniques to allow you to move them, but it is a little bit more challenging. So you need to consider, whatever place you decide to keep your hives, that they're the place that you're going to want to keep them long term. We see photos like this online, long beehives, in a row, and they are neatly laid out, and it is convenient for the beekeeper to go from one hive to the next hive to the next hive as they're, doing a hive inspection. But the bees can get confused, and something that we call drifting can happen, and so the bees can tell the difference between left versus right pretty easily. But for them to know that it's the third hive in from the left or the fifth hive in from the right is a little bit more confusing. And what often happens is they tend to drift towards the ends. So the hives towards the end tend to be strong from all the bees drifting there, whereas the middle hives tend to be weaker because the bees just don't find their way back. They just get confused. So sometimes we recommend laying out the apiary, the beehives in the bee yard, in different ways, and you can put them where the high entrances are facing in different directions, and that way they can orient, through the, whether the placement of the hives, or it could even be, through some of the plant life or fences or other things can help them orient back to their hives. In suburban or urban settings, try to be a good neighbor. Try to provide water so that your bees won't be going to your neighbor's swimming pool. You don't want your hives flying straight out over like a pathway or a sidewalk. They might not want to hurt anybody, but they could get stuck in somebody's hair, and you could get a stinging it, and potentially if that person is allergic, it could be a serious issue. And then pay attention to the local regulations. You might only be allowed to have a certain number of hives, or they may have to be set back from the property line by a certain amount or distance. So try to provide like sources of water, so the bees won't go to the swimming pool. A fence is very useful to allow the bees to fly up and over people's heads, and the people won't even know the hive is there. Now, in more remote settings, unfortunately, there are people who like to do things to hives just because. So they might push over or tip your hives. Sometimes they steal hives. Hives are worth a lot of money, especially in places where pollination is happening. They may come and steal hives. So I try to put them out of sight of the road and behind a gate if possible, so that they're not going to be stolen or no one's going to be there messing with them. Livestock, in particular cattle, can be hard on hives. They can push them over just scratching on them or rubbing on them. And then in some places there can be bears that want to get in your hives. Other creatures might include skunks, so you might have to put up some type of fencing or something to keep your hives protected from any of these predators that may be present. So that brings us to the end of this presentation, things to consider before you get started. So again, just think about it from this standpoint. Why do you want to become a beekeeper? And how much time, effort, and money are you willing to spend? Before you get your bees, try to learn as much as you can about them before you get bees, knowing that there's only so much you can learn from a book or from a YouTube video or from classes. Much of your learning is going to happen from just real life experience. If you can find a mentor or a beekeeping club, that can be very helpful for new beekeepers starting out. Always know your local regulations. Consider what the bees will need to succeed, and whether or not you'll need to help them out in order to help them succeed. And then also, where will you put your bees once you get them? Beekeeping is not as intuitive as keeping other creatures. It is a learning curve. So that's why you should try to learn as much as you can before you get your bees. And don't get discouraged. We've all been there. There's times when having many years, decades of experience, that sometimes I'm a little bit confused as to what's going on also. And if you're not sure, seek help from experienced beekeepers. And if you don't have a mentor, at least, ask some of the more experienced beekeepers in your area or in your beekeeping club if they have any ideas about what you might need to do or what might be going on. And then finally, after learning about all of this, if you decide that maybe you're not quite ready to keep bees for yourself, That's fine. It's better off not getting bees if you're not ready than getting them before you're ready, and then unfortunately maybe you might lose them or they might die. Just because you don't know what you need to do in order to keep them healthy and successful.